And as of 5 weeks ago, the United States has positioned itself to control the extraction, sale, and revenue distribution of that oil indefinitely. The question that should concern anyone watching the global economy is not whether this operation was legal or moral. That debate will continue for years. The question is what this means for the price of energy, the structure of global trade, the position of the dollar, and the flow of capital between nations. Because when you look past the headlines, past the dramatic footage and the political reactions, what you find is a structural shift in how the world's most powerful country is choosing to secure its economic position for the next 2 decades. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Venezuela used to be and how it got to where it is today. In the 1990s, Venezuela was producing 3.5 million barrels of oil per day. It was a founding member of OPEC. It was one of the most important energy suppliers to the United States. American refineries along the Gulf Coast were specifically built to process Venezuelan crude. Not any crude, Venezuelan crude. Because Venezuela produces heavy sour oil. It is thick, sulfur-rich, and relatively cheap. The refineries in Texas and Louisiana were engineered to handle exactly this type of oil. They are significantly more efficient when processing Venezuelan crude compared to the light, sweet oil produced domestically in the United States. American oil is excellent for making gasoline, but it is limited beyond that. Venezuelan oil can be refined into diesel, asphalt, heating oil, and industrial fuels. These are the products that keep supply chains moving, keep factories running, and keep infrastructure functioning. The relationship between the United States and Venezuelan oil was not incidental, it was architectural. It was built into the physical infrastructure of American energy. Then came Hugo Chavez, then came nationalization, then came the seizure of foreign assets. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips had their operations expropriated, international investment dried up. The technical expertise that maintained production left the country. And then came Maduro, who accelerated the decline through mismanagement, corruption, and authoritarian consolidation. Venezuelan oil production fell from 3.5 million barrels per day to barely 1 million. An 80% decline in GDP followed between 2012 and 2020. Hyperinflation reached 135,000% in 2018. Nearly 8 million Venezuelans fled the country. The largest proven oil reserves in the world sat underground, effectively locked away by political dysfunction and international sanctions. This is the part that most analysts overlook. The decline of Venezuelan oil production was not simply a Venezuelan problem. It was a structural gap in global energy markets. It meant that the specialized refining capacity along the Gulf Coast operated below optimal efficiency for years. It meant that diesel supply tightened globally, pushing prices higher for transportation and industrial use. It meant that the United States became more dependent on its own light crude, which is excellent for certain applications but inadequate for others. And it meant that China stepped in. As American and European companies were pushed out, Chinese state-owned enterprises filled the vacuum. China became Venezuela's primary lender, its largest oil buyer, and its most significant economic partner. Most Venezuelan oil exports in recent years flowed to China, settled in yuan, bypassing the dollar system entirely. China also embedded itself in Venezuelan mining operations, particularly in critical minerals used in advanced weapons systems and technology manufacturing. This is the context that makes the January 3rd operation legible as an economic event rather than simply a military one. The actual mechanics of the intervention tell you a great deal about priorities. The United States did not install the opposition candidate, who is widely believed to have won the 2024 Venezuelan election. Edmundo González remains in exile in Spain. Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader who won the Nobel Peace Prize, was told by the American president that she does not have the support to lead. Instead, the United States chose to work with Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's own vice president, who was sworn in as acting president 2 days after the operation. The decision to retain the existing power structure rather than support democratic transition is significant. It tells you that the primary objective was not political reform, it was operational continuity. The United States needed a functioning government apparatus to manage the oil transition. Installing an untested opposition figure would have introduced uncertainty. Working with Rodriguez, who had already been managing economic liberalization under Maduro, provided a faster path to the actual goal, restarting and controlling Venezuelan oil production. The economic architecture that has been put in place since the intervention confirms this reading. On January 7th, the Trump administration released a fact sheet stating that it would take over the marketing and sale of Venezuelan crude oil. All proceeds would settle in United States-controlled accounts. The initial phase would involve the sale of 30 to 50 million barrels, with operations continuing indefinitely. Only oil transported through channels authorized by the United States would be permitted to move in and out of the country. Venezuela's oil revenues would be deposited into a restricted account in Qatar, subject to American approval for disbursement. Venezuela must now submit budget requests for specific uses such as paying teachers, police, and healthcare workers. The United States would oversee the distribution. This is the mechanism that deserves careful attention. A sovereign nation's primary revenue source is now being managed through a foreign-controlled escrow system. The practical effect is that Venezuela's fiscal policy is no longer determined in Caracas. It is determined in Washington. This is not unprecedented in the broadest historical sense, but the scale is unusual. Venezuela's external debt stands at approximately $170 billion. Its creditors have been unable to seize oil revenues because of sanctions. Now, with the United States controlling the flow of funds, the question of who gets paid first becomes a matter of American policy. This creates leverage not only over Venezuela but over every entity that holds Venezuelan debt, including Chinese state banks, Russian energy companies, and various international bondholders. Acting President Rodriguez moved quickly. On January 15th, she proposed reforms to Venezuela's hydrocarbons law, aiming to attract foreign investment by easing restrictions that had favored nationalization for 25 years. The U.S. Energy Secretary announced plans to visit Venezuela to assess oil and gas operations. The message was clear. The door was opening for American oil majors to return. But the reality of rebuilding is far more complex than the political rhetoric suggests. PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, says its pipelines have not been updated in 50 years. Independent estimates suggest that simply maintaining current production levels would cost over $50 billion over the next 15 years. Restoring production to 2.5 million barrels per day would take 7 to 10 years and hundreds of billions of dollars in investment. And the oil companies that would need to make those investments are cautious. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips are still seeking compensation for assets seized years ago. At least one CEO publicly called Venezuela uninvestable. Chevron, the only American major still operating in the country, said only that it was following relevant laws and regulations. The industry remembers what happened the last time it invested heavily in Venezuela. It remembers the expropriations. It remembers the broken contracts. A change in political leadership does not automatically change the risk calculus when hundreds of billions of dollars are at stake. This brings us to the question that defines the economic logic of this operation. If Venezuelan oil cannot meaningfully enter global markets for years, if the investment required is enormous, and if the oil companies are hesitant, then what is the immediate strategic value? The answer lies not in what Venezuela produces today, but in what it represents structurally. Control over 303 billion barrels of proven reserves is a long-duration asset. It is a balance sheet item that changes the strategic calculus for decades. In a world where energy transitions are accelerating, where electric vehicles are displacing gasoline demand, and where renewable energy is growing faster than any model predicted 5 years ago, the value of oil reserves is actually declining over time. The window to monetize those reserves is narrowing. Every year that passes without development reduces their future value. The United States, already the world's largest oil producer at 13.5 million barrels per day, is not facing an immediate supply problem. American production is robust. Prices are moderate, around $55 to $57 per barrel. The global market is well supplied. OPEC is unwinding production cuts. The International Energy Agency projects supply could exceed demand by as much as 2 million barrels per day in 2026. There is no shortage, so the strategic logic must be understood through a different lens. This is not about filling a gap. This is about structural positioning. The United States is assembling the components of what some analysts are now calling a petro-empire. Domestically, the administration has pursued aggressive deregulation of fossil fuel production, opened public lands and waters, and created disincentives for competing technologies like wind energy and electric vehicles. Internationally, it has cultivated relationships with traditional petrostates like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And now, with Venezuela, it has added the world's largest reserve base to its sphere of influence. The implications for global energy politics are significant. Every barrel of Venezuelan oil that flows under American supervision is a barrel that does not flow to China. Before the intervention, Chinese state-owned companies were Venezuela's primary buyers. Most Venezuelan crude was settled in yuan. This represented a small but meaningful channel of de-dollarization in energy markets. That channel is now closed. The United States has explicitly stated that all Venezuelan oil transactions will go through authorized dollar-denominated channels. This is a direct reassertion of dollar primacy in a market segment where it had been eroding. The timing aligns with a broader pattern. 1 week before the Venezuela operation, India signed a massive trade deal with the European Union. 1 month after, India agreed to stop buying Russian oil in exchange for reduced American tariffs. The flow of energy is being redirected. Russian oil loses its largest Asian customer. Venezuelan oil loses its Chinese buyer. American companies positioned to rebuild Venezuelan production. Gulf Coast refineries prepare to receive the heavy crude they were designed to process. Each of these moves individually appears to be about bilateral trade or regional politics. Together, they form a coherent energy strategy, consolidate supply sources under dollar-denominated American supervised frameworks. Now consider the actors on the other side of this equation. China's response to the Venezuela intervention has been measured. Beijing condemned the operation diplomatically, but has not taken significant economic action. This restraint is telling. China holds substantial Venezuelan debt and had deep economic ties in the country. But China is also pragmatic. If American companies rebuild Venezuelan oil infrastructure and production increases substantially over the next decade, China may ultimately benefit from increased global supply and lower prices, even if it loses direct access to Venezuelan crude. China's energy strategy has been diversifying for years. It sources oil from Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Angola, Brazil, and others. Losing Venezuela is painful but not catastrophic. Russia's position is more exposed. The intervention came during active peace negotiations over Ukraine. The timing is not coincidental. Russia's war budget for 2026 remains near record highs despite mounting economic challenges from falling energy export revenues. If India follows through on its commitment to stop buying Russian oil, and if Venezuelan production eventually adds meaningful supply to global markets, the combined effect puts significant downward pressure on the prices Russia depends on to fund its military operations. The correlation between oil prices and Russia's ability to sustain the war in Ukraine is direct and measurable. Every dollar reduction in the price of oil reduces Russian government revenue and makes the cost of continuing the war incrementally more difficult to bear. This is the economic dimension of the peace negotiations happening in Abu Dhabi. The territorial disputes and security guarantees receive the headlines. But the energy economics underneath are shaping the actual leverage each party holds at the table. Latin America's reaction has been divided in ways that map precisely onto economic interests. Argentina, under President Milei, celebrated Maduro's capture and expressed support for U.S. control of Venezuelan oil. Argentina is developing its own massive Vaca Muerta shale formation and benefits from closer alignment with American energy interests. Brazil, under President Lula, condemned the operation. Brazil is a major oil producer itself, with growing output from its pre-salt deepwater fields. It also has significant economic ties to Venezuela and views American military intervention in the region as a direct threat to its own sovereignty. Colombia mobilized troops to its border. Nearly 3 million Venezuelan refugees are in Colombia. Political instability in Venezuela directly affects Colombian security and economics. The humanitarian dimension cannot be separated from the economic analysis. 56% of Venezuela's population lives in extreme poverty. Nearly 8 million people have fled the country. The economy contracted by an estimated 75 to 80% between 2012 and 2020. Inflation in 2026 is projected at 682%. The population that remains is dependent on government salaries and services. When the United States controls how oil revenues are dispersed, it effectively controls whether Venezuelan teachers get paid, whether hospitals receive supplies, whether the basic functions of the state continue to operate. This is an extraordinary degree of leverage. It means that every policy decision made by the Rodriguez government must account for American approval. The sovereignty implications are profound, but so are the humanitarian risks. If the revenue distribution system fails, if bureaucratic processes slow down, if political disagreements between Washington and Caracas emerge, the Venezuelan population bears the immediate cost. The legal framework surrounding this intervention is also generating structural uncertainty that affects investment decisions. The operation has been challenged on multiple grounds under international law. The UN Secretary General called it a dangerous precedent. 6 Latin American countries issued a joint statement rejecting the unilateral military action. Legal scholars have noted that neither self-defense nor Security Council authorization justifies the operation under existing international frameworks. The Maduro trial is set for March 2026, and the legal precedent of trying a captured sitting head of state in a domestic court will be debated for years. For energy companies evaluating whether to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in Venezuelan infrastructure, this legal uncertainty matters. If a future administration reverses course, if international courts rule against American control, if the political situation in Venezuela deteriorates into prolonged instability, those investments could be stranded. Iraq and Libya demonstrated that military intervention does not automatically produce stable investment environments. In both cases, oil production was disrupted for years after regime change, and the political instability that followed created conditions that were in many ways worse for energy markets than the regimes they replaced. The oil market's muted response to the intervention reflects this skepticism. Oil prices barely moved. West Texas Intermediate remains around $57 per barrel. The market is telling you something important. It does not believe that Venezuelan oil will meaningfully affect global supply in the near term. The oversupply conditions already present in the market, combined with OPEC unwinding its production cuts and new supply coming from Brazil, Guyana, and Argentina, mean that the world does not need Venezuelan barrels right now. The strategic value is long-term, the market impact is distant, and the risks are substantial. But there is another dimension that rarely gets discussed. Venezuela holds approximately 161 metric tons of official gold reserves, the largest in Latin America, worth over $23 billion at current market prices. The country also possesses significant untapped deposits of coltan, bauxite, iron, and other critical minerals. China had been developing mining operations in southern Venezuela to access these resources. With American oversight now extending to the broader economy, the question of who controls access to these mineral deposits becomes part of the strategic calculus. The same week the Venezuela operation occurred, the administration announced a $12 billion critical mineral stockpile program. Vice President Vance held meetings with officials from Europe, Asia, and Africa about forming a minerals buyers club to reduce dependence on Chinese processing. Venezuela's mineral wealth fits directly into this strategy. It is not only about oil. It is about the entire resource base and who controls access to it. The pattern that emerges when you step back and look at the full picture is one of resource consolidation. The United States is simultaneously increasing domestic fossil fuel production, asserting control over Venezuelan reserves, pressuring India away from Russian oil, negotiating tariff deals that include energy purchase commitments, and building strategic mineral stockpiles. Each action individually can be explained by specific bilateral dynamics, but collectively they represent a systematic effort to ensure that the flow of critical resources passes through dollar-denominated American supervised channels. Whether this strategy succeeds depends on variables that are still unfolding. Can Venezuelan production actually be rebuilt? Will oil companies overcome their hesitation and invest at the necessary scale? Will the Rodriguez government remain cooperative, or will internal power struggles create instability? Will China accept the loss of its Venezuelan position or find ways to reassert influence? Will the legal challenges to the intervention create enough uncertainty to deter long-term capital commitment? Will oil prices remain low enough to make the massive investment required economically questionable? These are not rhetorical questions. Each one represents a decision point that will determine trillions of dollars in capital allocation over the coming decade. The International Energy Agency projects that global oil demand will peak before 2030. If that projection holds, the window to monetize Venezuela's reserves is approximately 15 to 20 years. The infrastructure investment required takes 7 to 10 years to reach meaningful production levels. The timeline is tight, and every year of delay reduces the long-term value of the asset. The flow of money in global energy markets is being redirected. Channels that existed for decades are being closed. New channels are being opened. The entities that control those channels will shape economic outcomes for a generation. Venezuela is not the whole story. It is one piece of a larger reconfiguration that includes the India tariff deal, the Ukraine peace negotiations, the critical minerals strategy, and the broader shift in American trade policy. But it may be the most revealing piece because it demonstrates, more clearly than any tariff schedule or trade agreement, how the relationship between military power and economic control operates in practice. The last element worth examining is what this means for the concept of energy sovereignty globally. If the world's largest oil reserves can be placed under foreign control through a military operation justified by drug trafficking charges, what does that signal to other resource-rich nations? The question is being asked in capitals across the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia. Countries with significant oil, gas, and mineral reserves are watching how the international community responds. If the response is effectively acquiescence, it changes the risk calculus for every nation whose primary economic asset sits underground. It incentivizes faster resource extraction, quicker deal-making with major powers, and accelerated diversification away from dependence on any single commodity. In other words, the Venezuela precedent may accelerate the very trends it was designed to manage. Countries watching this unfold will move faster to secure their resources through bilateral agreements, alternative payment systems, and diversified partnerships. The short-term effect is American consolidation. The long-term effect may be the opposite. This is the tension at the center of the current moment in global economics. The system that has governed international trade and resource allocation for decades is being stress-tested simultaneously from multiple directions. Tariff wars are reshaping trade flows, peace negotiations are restructuring energy dependencies, military interventions are redefining resource access, and through all of it, the fundamental question remains the same. Who controls the flow of money? Not the headlines, not the political theater, not the dramatic footage, the money. Where does it originate? Through which channels does it move? Who takes a cut at each stage, and who decides where it ultimately lands? Venezuela's 303 billion barrels of oil are worth, at current prices, roughly $17 trillion. That number is theoretical. Most of it will never be extracted. But even a fraction of that value, managed over 2 decades through dollar-denominated channels under American supervision, represents an enormous economic asset. The question is whether the architecture being built to capture that value is sustainable or whether it creates more instability than it resolves. The market is not answering that question yet. Prices are stable, volatility is low, the world has absorbed the news and moved on to the next headline. But the structural changes are underway. Capital is being allocated, pipelines are being assessed, legal frameworks are being drafted. And somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, refineries that were built decades ago to process Venezuelan crude are preparing for a product they have not received at scale in years. The flow of money does not care about political opinions. It does not care about moral judgments. It follows incentives, seeks efficiency, and responds to power. Right now, the incentives, the efficiency calculations, and the power dynamics all point in one direction. The question is not whether Venezuela's oil will be developed. The question is who benefits, who pays, and what it costs the system when the largest proven reserves on Earth become a tool of one nation's strategic agenda. That is the question that will define the next chapter of global energy economics, not whether the operation was right or wrong, but whether the system being built around it is stable enough to hold. Because history tells us that when you concentrate control over critical resources in ways that exclude major global players, the excluded do not simply accept their position, they find alternatives, they build new systems, they redirect the flow, and the money eventually finds a way around every wall you build. The only question is how long the wall holds and what happens when it does not.